Namaste everyone. My name is Faculty of Non-Governance, and in this session we are going to talk about victimology. Now, what is victimology? Now, the term victimology is not new. In fact, Benjamin Mendelssohn first used it in 1947 to describe the scientific study of crime victims. And victimology is often considered as a field of criminology. The two fields do share much in common. Just as criminology is the study of criminals, what they do, why they do, and how the criminal justice system responds to them. Victimology is the study of victims. Victimology is the study of the etiology, that is, causes of victimization, its consequences, and how the criminal justice system accommodates and assists victims, and how other elements of society, such as media, deal with crime victims. Victimology is a science. Victimologists use the scientific method to answer questions about victims. For example, instead of simply wondering or hypothesizing why younger people are more likely to be victims than are older people, victimologists conduct research to attempt to identify the reasons why younger people seem more vulnerable. Now, let us go to the history of victimology. The history of victimology goes back to mid-1900s because the term victimology was coined in mid-1900s. So crime was of course occurring prior to this time. Thus people were being victimized long before the scientific study of crime victims began. And even though they were not studied scientifically, victims were recognized as being harmed by crime, and their role in criminal justice system process has evolved over time. And before and throughout the Middle Ages, that is about 5th century to 16th century, the burden of justice system, as informal as it was, fell on the victim. So when a person or property was harmed, it was up to the victims and victims' family to seek justice, and this was typically achieved via retaliation. The justice system operated under the principle of lex talionis. You must have heard about it, an eye for an eye. This is the principle of lex talionis. So a criminal would be punished because he or she deserved it, and the punishment would be equal to the harm caused. So punishment based on these notions is consistent with retribution. So during this time, a crime was considered a harm against the victims, not the state. The concept of restitution and retribution governed action against criminals. Criminals were expected to pay back the victim through restitution. During this time, a criminal who has stolen a person's cow likely to have compensated the owner by returning the stolen cow and also giving him or her another one. Early criminal codes incorporated these principles. So the earliest code, that is the Code of Hammurabi, was the basis for order and certainty in Babylon. Now in that code, restoration of equity between the offender and victim was stressed upon. Now notice that the early response to crime centered on the victim and not on the state. So this focus on the victim continued until the Industrial Revolution, when criminal law shifted to consider crimes violation against the state rather than the victim. Once the victim ceased to be seen as the entity harmed by the crime, the victim became secondary and the state becomes the first. Although this shift most certainly benefited the state by allowing it to collect fines and monies from those newly defined harms, the victims did not fare as well. Instead of being the focus, the crime victim was effectively excluded from the formal aspects of the justice system. Since then, the state-centered system has largely remained in place, but attention to the least from research and activists returned to the crime victim during 1940s, and it was beginning in this period. Concern was shown for the crime victim, but this concern was not entirely sympathetic. Instead, scholars and others became preoccupied with how the crime victim contributes to his or her own victimization. Scholarly work during this period focused not on the needs of the crime victims but on identifying to what extent victims would be held responsible for being victimized. Now, it is in this way the damage that offenders caused was ignored. Instead, the ideas of victim precipitation, victim facilitation, and victim provocation emerged. Now, what could be the role of victim in crime? That is, and this can be understood through three prongs, that is, victim precipitation, victim facilitation, and victim provocation. Now, although the field of victimology has largely moved away from simply investigating how a victim contributes to his or her own victimization, the first the first few theories uh, forays into the study of crime victims were centered on such investigations. In this way, the first studies of crime victims did not portray victim as innocents who were wronged at the hands of offender. Rather, concepts such as precipitation, victim facilitation, and victim provocation developed from these investigations. A victim precipitation is defined as the extent to what a victim is responsible for his or her, his or her own victimization. The concept of victim participation is rooted in the notion that although some victims are not at all responsible for their victimization, other victims are. So, in this way, victim participation acknowledges that crime victimization involves at least two people, an offender and a victim. You might have heard in Hindi, एक हाथ से ताली नहीं बजती. This is what victim participation is all about. And concept that the both parties are acting and often reacting before, during, and after the incident. Identifying victim precipitation does not necessarily lead to negative outcomes. It is problematic, however, when it is used to blame the victim while ignoring the offender's role. You might have heard oftenly by our politicians for blaming women for wearing short skirts, wearing clothes, and ये तो बच्चे हैं इनसे गलतियाँ हो जाती हैं. And a woman has to look at herself first and then to blame on the offender. So this is all was the primary uh, issues with the concept of victimization. Similar to victim precipitation is the concept of victim facilitation. Victim facilitation occurs when a victim unintentionally makes it easier for an offender to commit a crime. A victim may, in this way, be a catalyst for victimization. A woman who accidentally left her purse in plain view in her office while she went to the restroom and then had it stolen would be a victim who facilitated her own victimization. We call it in India अपने सामान की सुरक्षा स्वयं करें, right? And this woman is not blameworthy. The offender should not steal, regardless of whether the purse is in plain view. But the victim's action certainly made her a likely target and made it easy for the offender to steal her purse. Unlike precipitation, facilitation helps understand why one person may be victimized all another over another, but does not connote blame and responsibility. Now, let's come to victim provocation. Contrast victim facilitation with victim provocation. Victim provocation occurs when a person does something that incites another person to commit an illegal act. Provocation suggests that without the victim's behavior, the crime would not have occurred. Provocation then most certainly connotes blame. In fact, the offender is not at all responsible. An example of victim provocation would be if a person attempted to mug a man who was walking home from work, and then man, instead of willingly giving the offender his wallet, pulled out a gun and shot the mugger. The offender in this scenario ultimately is a victim, and he would not have been shot if not for attempting to mug the shooter. The distinctions between victim precipitation, facilitation, and provocation are not always clear cut. These terms were developed, described, studied, and used in somewhat different ways in the mid 1900s by several scholars. We will look to them one by one. So let us first look at Hans von Henting. So, in his book The Criminal and His Victim, Studies in the Sociology of Crime, Hans von Henting recognized the importance of investigating what factors underpin why certain people are victims, just as criminology attempts to identify those factors that produce criminality. Now, I will try to return this link between victims and offenders in later sessions, but for now, recognize that one of the first discussions of criminal victimization in studying victimization Henting has been occurred by von Henting. Now, when von Henting was studying victimization, he looked at the criminal victim dyad, thus recognizing the importance of considering the victim and the criminal not in isolation but together. He attempted to identify the characteristics of a victim that may effectively serve to increase victimization risk. He considered that victims may provoke victimization, acting as agent provocators, and based on their characteristics, he argued that crime victims could be placed into one of 13 categories based on their propensity for victimization. Now, notice the word propensity for victimization, that is inclination for victimization, as if I want to become the victim. Now, the first is young, second is female, old, immigrants, depressed, mentally defective, deranged, the acquisitive, dull normals, minorities, vantons, the lonesome and heartbroken, tormentor, the blocked, exempted, the fighting. All of these, what I've told you, are 13 basic categories of person who has this propensity for victimization. Now, to give you an example, the young, the old, and the females may be victimized because of their ignorance or risk taking, or may be taken advantage of, such as when women are sexually assaulted. Immigrants and minorities and dull normals are likely to be victimized due to their social status and inability to activate assistance in the community. The mentally defective or deranged may be victimized because they do not recognize or appropriately respond to threats in the environment. Now, those who are depressed, acquisitive, wanton, lonesome, and heartbroken may place themselves in situations in which they do not recognize danger because of their mental state, their sadness, and their lost relationship, their desire for companionship, and their greed. Tormentors are people who provoke their own victimization via violence, aggression towards others. Finally, the blocked, exempted, and fighting victims are those who are enmeshed in poor decisions and unable to defend themselves or seek assistance if victimized. An example of such a victim is a person who is blackmailed because of his behavior, which places him in a precarious situation if he reports the blackmail to the police. Now we will see about Benjamin Mendelssohn in the next session. So I will end this session by summarizing the teachings of this session. That is how in earlier society, the the focus was on victim instead of the state, and how victimology, when started, focused on the propensity of victimization presented in certain persons. And as per Helsting, he created 13 categories of human beings who has this inclination for becoming victimization. To sum this up, I would say that imagine uh, if there is a person who is returning from his office and sees that there are two persons fighting and one is trying to kill the other, and this person who is returning from office intervenes them, then Helston would say that this person who is returning from office is having a propensity for victimization, because if had he not intervened uh, that fight, he would not have become victim. So it is with this victimology comes into existence. And in the next session, we will definitely talk about Benjamin Mendelssohn, who is also referred to as father of victimology. Till then, thank you.